"Senior, this time, you can't escape." The smile on the man's face was evil, pinning Robert between himself and the wall, and his hand also pinched Robert's jaw, forcing him to face himself directly. When Robert looked at this man who was 10.5 centimeters taller than himself, his heart suddenly beat a beat faster. He almost went out of the movie because of this beat, and felt that he shouldn't have. After all, he had never encountered this kind of situation before. Thinking this way, Robert quickly adjusted his state by virtue of his deep skills and returned to his role in the movie, only to see a blush appear on his face. At the same time, his eyes also began to wander, and someone to get rid of the man's constraints. However, his hand on the man's pecs just landed on the man's chest vainly, as if he was afraid of grasping the robust muscle solidly. In close-ups, Robert showed that shy, resistant expression with a hint of anticipation in it to the fullest. The taller man deadpanned Robert, gaining an inch and pressing his thumb against Robert's thin lips, trying to gently press and rub them. But only just making contact. The soft touch distracted him for a moment. He froze for a moment before slowly leaning down, ready to taste what those thin lips actually tasted like. Just a second before their lips were about to collide, an abrupt voice interrupted the man's continued movements. Cut. The one who spoke was Wen Liang, the director of the play, who frowned as he looked at the monitor and then looked up at the two men. And with being told to stop, Grace's eyes flashed with a hint of regret. He really wanted to kiss Robert. With that thought, he then looked at the red lips close at hand and suddenly pursed them, impulsively wanting to finish what was left unfinished. However, before he could act, Robert suddenly opened his eyes. His complexion was clear, without the blush he had just felt. Even though a handsome face occupied his entire field of vision, Robert only slightly hooked the corner of his lips and gave Grace a friendly yet detached smile. Then, he slightly pushed the person who was pressing in front of him away, as if he was completely unattracted by the temptation of the full pecs under his hands. Only the gentle twiddling of his fingers as he stuck them in his pockets after the two had separated still didn't fool himself. This kid's got a great body. The thought crossed Robert's mind instantly, but he adjusted quickly and leaned up from the wall. Robert, what you just did was great, just the kind of feeling I was looking for. As Wen Liang approached, the last trace of ambiguity between Robert and Grace was dispersed. Hearing the praise for self, Robert just nodded his head lightly at Wen Liang. I'm flattered, Director One. Wen Liang similarly nodded at him and didn't say anything more. Instead, when he twisted his head to look at Grace, his expression brought some accusation. Grace, what were you thinking just now? Why are you dragging your feet? Do you realize that because of your procrastination, the persona has directly collapsed? The few seconds Grace froze just now was a completely undeserved mistake in Wen Liang's opinion. In his opinion, every bit of Robert's performance just now was just right, especially in line with the character's psychological activities. But just because of Grace's little bit of hesitation, the most wonderful part of the whole clip instantly lost that feeling. Grace was equally aware that he had just gone out of character because he was too excited. Therefore, he just opened his mouth and did not defend himself. In fact, today was Grace's first time to shoot a close and intimate scene with his beloved Robert. And in that instant, he simply couldn't restrain himself from wanting to sauce and stuff with Robert, and at the same time, a little worry rose, worrying that if he really kissed up to him, Robert would be disgusted with him. I'm sorry, Director One. I did get lost in thought just now. Seeing that Wen Liang still wanted to reprimand a few times, Robert opened his mouth. Director One, this is only the first shot. Since you don't feel satisfied, just shoot again. Robert had been filming with Grace for so many days, and knew clearly that Grace was not stupid. Even if there were occasional mistakes, Grace could adjust quickly. On another note, as Grace was a junior in the same company, Robert felt that he should still take care of her a bit more. But when he said this, Wen Liang felt that something was wrong. After filming for so long, he had never seen Robert speak up for others. But Wen Liang felt that it wasn't anything noteworthy, so he didn't put it on his mind and sold Robert a favor. All right, then shoot it again. Saying that, he grabbed the script and pointed it out to Grace. Here, if you can't catch a chance, count 3 silently in your mind, okay? Grace hastily nodded her head in response. Uh-huh. I understand. I'll definitely memorize it. All right then, let's do it again. After Wen Liang finished speaking, he turned around and walked towards the monitor. Instead, it was Grace who took advantage of this gap, slightly lowered her head, and came up to Robert's ear. Thank you, Robert Sr., for relieving me. Blown by the warm breath, Robert felt his ears itch a little, but didn't say anything and leaned himself against the wall. Second time, ready, action. Between one breath and the other, Robert's breath instantly changed from a cool god to a shy and weak victim, as he leaned against the wall and waited for Grace's abuse. Grace, on the other hand, first took a deep breath, closed her eyes and pressed down the distractions in her mind before opening her eyes violently. At this time, his eyes were also recolored with evil charm. He braced himself against the wall behind Robert, enveloping Robert in his own shadow, and with his other hand, he cupped Robert's jaw and lifted it slightly. Senior, you can't escape this time. As the words fell, the corners of his lips hooked up slightly, his eyes filled with the fascination for Robert that the character shared with self. 3, 2, 1. As she finished the 3 count in her mind, Grace no longer had any hesitation and boldly, but firmly leaned down, making a move to kiss. However, it was not to be. Cut. This one passed. Wenliang again shouted to stop a second before Grace was about to kiss Robert. As Wenliang's voice reached her ears, Grace suddenly stiffened. Damn it. It was so close. He could even feel the collision of the subtle fuzz at the corners of their lips. In a flash of lightning, before Robert could open his eyes, a rush of hot blood rushed to his heart, and Grace kissed Robert on the lips without thinking. He didn't want to pretend to be a well-behaved stepchild in front of Robert anymore. The touch was very soft, as if a kitten was scratching lightly, making both of their hearts flutter. But in the next instant, Robert opened his eyes in slight shock and pushed Grace away eagerly once again. You. But before Robert could say his reproachful words, Grace took 2 steps back in a panic and bent her waist reverently. Elder, I'm sorry. I was just too deep into the scene and didn't notice. Although his tone was flustered, a hint of a leap rose in his heart. He had finally kissed. But Robert didn't get to see Grace's arched brow and only listened to his apologetic voice, clenching his fists in bewilderment. It was strange to say that he, Robert, was 28 years old and had stepped into the acting industry for so many years, but whether in life or on screen, his first kiss was actually still there. And today his first kiss was actually by this small self 8 years of young to go. Robert pursed his lips, still feeling that the feeling brought by that touching moment still lingered on his lips, making him unforgettable. However, looking at Grace, who had already bowed and apologized to self, Robert couldn't blame her any further and could only smile helplessly. What else could he say? Saying that Grace stole his first kiss? It's not like he was an 18-year-old love brain who valued his first kiss more than anything else. Even he would find it funny if he said that. Finally pressing down the various emotions that welled up in his heart, Robert calmly patted Grace's shoulder and lifted his feet to find Wenliang, leaving only one sentence for Grace. It's okay, just act well. But Grace froze in place because of his emotionless reaction. He had thought about what he should say if Robert hated him. Could it be that he really was nothing in Robert's eyes? Grace stood up straight and frowned at Robert's back. Grace felt himself excited that his heart was going to jump out. 5 years. He had been thinking about him for 5 years. Even Grace felt that the impulse she had just felt was a stroke of genius. He lowered his eyes, covered up the infatuation of Robert in his heart, and pressed his hand on his lips. For a moment, Grace felt a little lost. He didn't know what the next step should be. Should he ride the wave? Or to resume his role as the respectful stepchild? At the time of his sexual orientation initiation, Grace felt that he was different from the other students. While his classmates are talking about the opposite sex, his focus is always on the same sex. Even when his friends dragged him to watch action movies, his focus was always on the male actors. At first, he pretended to agree with his classmates, and then he stumbled upon the term homosexuality on the internet, and slowly realized that he liked the same sex, which was different from most people. It was at this moment of confusion that Robert appeared in his world. At that time, Robert, who had just started his career, was criticized for being in a CP relationship, and he directly held a press conference. In that press conference, Robert even said, "I will use my strength to give back to everyone's favorite, but also please respect my private life. Whether I'm single or in a relationship, like boys or girls, please be rational." Such grandiose words. As a freshly minted artist, how strong of a mental capacity should Robert have to be able to say this? Grace didn't know, but Grace could feel everyone's cynicism towards Robert just from the comment section at that time. However, Robert did not suffer from the blow as Grace thought he would. After half a year in hiding, Robert proved to everyone with his first drama to prove his strength to everyone. He was no longer a fresh meat love bean who simply relied on fan traffic to make a living. His new identity was an actor, and one whose acting skills were recognized by the audience. Since then, Grace began to pay attention to Robert's every move, and even had the desire to meet Robert in person to see if he was really as good as he said he was, able to make other people recognize him by his strength. The more she watched, the more Grace felt that Robert was like a ray of light that fascinated him. Finally, after 5 years of learning the art of acting, Grace entered Robert's world and met the man himself. He was going to level with this man. Attention all. Stand by for the next scene. Wynn's voice came, ground-waking Grace, who was lost in thought. He hurriedly put down his glass of water and walked to the original spot. Action. In the corner of the building, Charles had Natasha sandwiched between himself and the wall, grinning nastily and whispering something borderline unintelligible. But what should have been a beautiful sight was disrupted by the sudden appearance of a girl. "Charles, what are you guys doing?" Natasha, who had just indulged in lovemaking, was like a frightened deer, red-faced and eager to push Charles away. Charles frowned impatiently, but did not continue to confine the person in his arms, allowing Natasha to break free and leave. Natasha kept her head down, not daring to look at whoever it was. But Olivia had Natasha's appearance firmly in her mind. You're the one who stole my childhood friend. A glimmer of gloom flashed in Olivia's eyes, but when she turned to Charles, it was nothing but resignation. She still couldn't believe her own suspicions and wanted a definitive answer. Charles, what is your relationship with him? But the good thing was interrupted. Charles didn't care if she was some kind of childhood friend, and didn't give a good face at all. None of your business. Olivia, I've said before, I'm not interested in you. Please don't come back to pester me. Do you not understand the words? After saying that, he finished trying to lift his leg to leave. Olivia, however, directly reached out to stop Charles's way. But even after stopping the person, Olivia just stared at Charles with complicated eyes and actually didn't know what to say. The two of them were obviously childhood friends, and she had even borrowed so much money from his father, that drunkard, behind his family's back for him. But what about this man? This man just said that he didn't like it. We are not suitable, and let her previous heartbeat, previous efforts all go down the drain. Until today, Olivia finally realized that it was the male fox who seduced away her man. The more she thought about it, the more angry she became, and the angry words came out of her mouth. You shameless. Pulling and tugging with a man. I kind of see through you. You're a sodomite. I'm going to tell your father about this. Charles's face instantly changed at these words, and in a fit of rage, he slapped away Olivia's hand that was pointing at his nose. TSK, I advise you to better shut up and not say anything in front of my dad. Otherwise, there will be hell to pay. How dare you hit me? The pain coming from the back of her hand made Olivia not even hear what Charles was saying. She just looked at the man who broke her heart with disbelief. She couldn't understand Charles, why he was like this, when they used to be so happy. But in the next second, she gathered her weakness and shouted at Charles in the same way. You think I'm afraid of you? Try moving me again if you dare. A flash of clarity flashed under Charles's eyes, not wanting to dwell on it. He stepped around Olivia and prepared to leave. For the sake of the love we had, I won't move you today, so get out. Olivia tried to stop, but she didn't realize that Charles didn't collect his strength at all and was directly knocked to the ground. Are you really that desperate? I'll return all the things you once got from my family, and we'll leave it at that. Don't come back to me in the future. After saying that, Charles closed his eyes and lifted his foot to leave with big strides. Olivia, that was both exasperated and shocked, screamed in place. What do you mean that's it? Charles, you come back. But no matter how hoarse she was, her voice just hovered impotently in the hallway. Charles would never look back at her again. Cut. This one's over. At the sound of the voice, Grace dropped the aura around her and transformed back into her little puppy look. Phew. He turned back and walked to Amelia, handing out his hand in a friendly manner, allowing Amelia to use his strength to stand up, and then smiled sarcastically. Amelia, I'm really sorry about just now. You didn't fall and hurt, did you? Amelia pulls away a bit as she uses his hand to stand up, returning an equally light smile. It's fine, if I felt too fake just now, certain big directors will be unhappy, don't you think? With that, she slanted a glance at Wen Liang. Grace followed her gaze and nodded in agreement. He was truly afraid of Wen Liang saying to do it again. This person was too good at picking out details. However, Wen Liang was unaware of the whispering crickets of these two and picked up his own trumpet. That's it for today, everyone go back and rest. Finally off duty. Amelia glanced at the time and suddenly became anxious, waving her hand at Grace. No more chit-chat. No more chit-chat. I have something to do later. I have to withdraw first. Okay. Bye, Amelia. Grace watched her scurry off to the break room to collect her things, blinking, her mind speculating a little. Going on a date? He'd seen Amelia's little antics many times over the days of filming, including, but not limited to, reaching for her cell phone to return messages after a scene, leaving at a pinch, having someone order takeout to drop off every now and then, and so on. It's hard not to be suspicious. Clearly outwardly declared single. However, Grace wasn't interested in eating melon. He had a more important matter, so he took a brisk pace to find Robert. Senior, what do you want to eat tonight? I'll treat you. Right. That's right. He wanted to make a dinner date with Robert. Grace. Robert was taking off his costume when he heard the voice and turned back to see Grace with a big smile on her face, eye-catching as hell. He was suddenly a little embarrassed. How can I let you, a newcomer to the company, treat me? It just so happens that I'm free. What do you want to eat? I'll treat you. Robert counted in his heart. After so many days of filming with Grace, he hadn't eaten together yet, thanks to him being Grace's senior. No. Seeing Robert taking off his costume and preparing to put it away, Grace immediately came forward to help. Senior, let me help you pack up. After receiving so much care from you these days, to show my gratitude, of course I should be the one to treat you. Robert didn't flash. The costume was received by Grace. Think about it, and let him go. But his mouth was still polite. You've just started earning money. It's better for me to treat you. Speaking of which, he is quite optimistic about Grace as a junior. Acting is really quite talented. And, also very suitable for the eyes. If he's a few years younger, or Grace is a few years older, he really has to make a move. Grace didn't understand the emotions in Robert's eyes, and after helping him hang up his costume, she was ready to change the costume on herself. Think of it as me thanking you for helping me out today. Seeing that Robert turned his back and didn't look at himself, he licked his lips and continued. Besides, you don't know the condition of my family, so what kind of money can you save for me? Only after saying so, Robert remembered Grace's background. It's all because this person usually doesn't have any young master stance at all. Hearing the person behind him change his clothes, Robert turned around and no longer pushed back Grace's invitation. All right, I'll choose what to eat. He just wants to finish the meal quickly and keep a friendly social distance from Grace, lest he really looks at Grace. He wouldn't dare to touch this person. Following Robert out the door, Grace grinned behind him and cheered in her heart. Hey, Robert Sr. promised. He's going to chase Robert to his hand step by step. Sure, Senior, choose whatever you want. If I don't have enough money, I'll sell my body to pay for it. Hearing Grace snickering, Robert walks ahead and smiles softly. You're a young master of a rich family who doesn't have enough money and needs to sell his body? Thinking so, the touch of the full pectoral muscles during the shooting suddenly came to mind, causing Robert to twist his fingers again. I have to say, it was indeed very material. He suddenly tucked his hands into his pockets and clenched his fists. Can't think about it anymore. Messing with my morals. He and Grace were 8 years apart, counting by the 3-year generation gap. There was a chasm between them all, so he automatically excluded Grace from the range of candidates for a relationship. Because of the same movie, the company only sent Robert's assistant Steven over to take care of both of their chores at the same time, and this moment has already driven the car to the door. Once in the car, Robert opened his mouth and reported the name of a Western restaurant. Shunzi, a moment to send us to. You go back first, after we go back on our own. Hey, okay, Robert. Steven nodded his head in the driver's seat and answered, entered the address on the navigation, and didn't ask much. He had followed Robert for a few years, and now he was considered to be obedient. After dropping the two off at the place, he didn't think much of it, leaving Robert and Grace to have a two-person world. Robert realized that he didn't have any friendship with Grace, so he chose a more affordable restaurant. Have you ever come to eat? No, Grace smiled and shook her head, looking around at the decor without a hint of amazement in her eyes. Just as well, the man was a young master. Robert smiled to himself. He'd looked at it for a long time back, when he'd first come here. Stop calling me senior. I'm getting old by you. Just call me Robert like Junko. He settled down with Grace, and feeling a little hot took off the shirt he was wearing only a heavy cotton short sleeve. While wearing the shirt, Grace felt that Robert was very much the style of an ascetic male god, but as Robert took it off like that, Grace felt a brightening of her eyes, not unlike the way Robert looked in the interviews back then, like a big brother next door, which made people feel especially close. Robert took in all of Grace's looks and just smiled faintly, not thinking much about it. He was a pale man, and the best thing he could do was to keep silent. It was also a good thing Grace was a happy puppy and never let the scene get cold. Robert, you were really real today. I forgot who you were and subbed in Charles's perspective. Of course, it was really thanks to Charles that he dared to use his role to bring out his self-liking. Ever since he joined the company and finally started to have contact with Robert, it had become more and more difficult for him to suppress the lust in his heart, and through the character's feelings, he had seen how Self felt about Robert. He likes Robert, and he wants to pursue Robert. Robert was a little hard to resist Grace's passionate eyes. He looked away and said lightly, "It's okay. I've done it more often. I'm getting used to it. You're pretty good at acting too. You have a strong foundation and a lot of talent." Right. Grace accepted Robert's praise without modesty. I will definitely catch up with Robert. He said this firmly, as if he was talking about some lofty dream, and Robert felt a little embarrassed as he listened. Catch up with me for what? I haven't even gotten Best Actor yet. Speaking of this matter, he was angry. If not for that person's sudden interruption, he definitely secured it last time. Grace, as the young master, also knew the way inside, and immediately became indignant for Robert. Robert, your acting skills are much better than that person. You will definitely be able to do it this time. Humph. Robert non-committally grunted lightly and didn't continue the topic. By your math, you've only been in school for a little over 2 years. When you think about Grace's age, that's pretty fast at a normal point in time. What he didn't realize, however, was that Grace hadn't actually been honestly following the crowd. In fact, full stop, I've been studying acting for almost 4 years now. He finished learning the basics in advance, and after that, he invited the old movie star who had already retired to do the guidance. Plus, he had talent in himself, and nowadays, his strength could be said to be a big step above his peers. Otherwise, it would not have been director when selected as the second male. He did not let his family help to bring funds into the group. Even if the company's boss, Uncle Zhao, helped him to say hello to the director of the one, it can only be considered to be an opportunity to get a trial scene. Knock knock. 2 gentlemen are interrupting. Your dishes have been served. The waiter pushed a small food cart into the cubicle, dispersing the surprise in Robert's heart. Not bad for a young master. To think he was still fumbling around when he was 20. But soon his recollection was interrupted by Grace's excited voice. Wow, Robert, it all looks so good. It smells so good. It's delicious at first glance. It's worthy of Robert's choice of store. With that, he pulled out his cell phone and waved it at Robert. Cell phone first. Robert doesn't mind, right? Robert certainly doesn't mind. He picked up the red wine and poured it for the two of them, allowing Grace to take pictures as a souvenir. What was the young master so excited about? Make it look like you haven't had any. Despite this thought, Robert hid the upturned corners of his lips with a glass of red wine. He still ate it up. After taking pictures of each dish, Grace secretly put up his cell phone and slowly panned the camera upward on Robert. But what he did not expect is that Robert was born with a keen intuition about the camera, and saw on the cell phone screen, Robert's eyes were staring straight at self, scared him so much that his fingers trembled, and immediately tapped to the photo button, and then awkwardly put away the cell phone. Take a picture if you wanna, what are you sneaking around for? Maybe Grace's action was too exaggerated. Robert felt a bit funny. He didn't mind Grace taking pictures. What Grace didn't know was that if someone else was sitting across from Robert, it wouldn't be such an attitude. Robert, you don't mind? Grace rubbed the tip of her nose and smiled awkwardly. Robert thought for a moment, and suddenly changed his face and stared gravely into Grace's eyes. What if I do mind? Grace winced at his look. It was too oppressive. Obviously, he was the one who was 5 feet 8 inches, but facing Robert's eyes, he felt like the two of them had swapped heights. Or should I delete it? It won't happen next time. Seeing that the young man was scared by himself, Robert suddenly put away his stance and smiled gently in a very good mood. It's okay. Let's eat. Huh. Grace was ready to unlock and delete the photos. Only then did she react. Robert, are you playing with me? Chapter 4. Robert accepted Grace's accusation frankly, not justifying his own behavior. Let's eat. He picked up the knife and fork, elegantly cut the steak into his mouth, as if he was a nobleman. Although Grace's family is well educated, she has rarely seen such an elegant person, really like the vampire count in the movie, enviable. Robert ate quietly, but Grace couldn't sit still after 2 bites. How can he say he had to put some emotional value on Robert? Robert, this tomahawk steak is so good. It's so tender from his house. And the flavor is just right. It's not too salty. Ooh, the tempura is so crispy. It's also pretzel flavored. It's delicious. Hey, his salad tastes so special. Is there some kind of soul sauce? He had to come up with such a sentence for every dish he ate, making Robert a bit embarrassed. It was just a meal. How come he didn't feel so much? Even the first time he came here, he didn't feel so amazing, right? Just that he didn't even know that the corners of Self's lips had silently curled up at Grace's sentence of praise. It's good that you like it. Eat more, grow your body. Grace nodded in obedience to Robert's words and said vaguely before the contents of his mouth were completely swallowed. Robert recommended it. Of course I like it. He said it sincerely, but the meaning changed in Robert's ears. What do you mean you like it if I recommend it? What does it have to do with me? Robert raised his wine glass and gave Grace a sign. Well, it's quite good. He didn't dare to think too much about it, and just assumed that Grace was usually so big-headed. With Robert as a companion, Grace completely forgot his own 3 cups down the amount of alcohol, red wine a cup after a cup of renewals. After a meal, his whole body is dizzy. With the strength of wine, he looked at Robert with watery eyes, and remembered the impulsive act of aggression committed by himself in the daytime. Robert, Yumi, I'm so sorry for kissing you today. I didn't expect it. I was feeling it, wanting to kiss, and I didn't get out of the act for a while. You don't mind, do you? While Grace restrained herself from saying the wrong thing with the last vestiges of her sanity, Robert didn't expect it to be brought up again. He had wanted to let it die with the wind. He was a 28-year-old bachelor, so what could he do if he got his first kiss? Could he still grab Grace and kiss her back? Grace. Robert laughed softly to himself, but his eyes didn't dare to meet with Grace. I told you. It's all a drama. It's okay. Don't take it to heart. If you don't say anything, I'm going to forget about it. But Grace suddenly got emotional. How can that be? That was my first kiss. How can I forget that? So what do you want? I'll give you another one. Robert didn't voice his self-satisfied thoughts and went to look at Grace squarely, just assuming the man was already drunk. Have you eaten yet? I'll get the check. His tone suddenly turned a little cold, and before Grace could respond, he got up and walked out of the cubicle. The sudden change stirred Grace into immediate sobriety, and it was only then that she reacted to what Self had said. Robert. He tried to call Robert back, but the man had already disappeared in the doorway, and could only let out a helpless sigh. It was on me. He should have asked Robert how he felt. How did it come out that it was Self's first time? He just wanted to know if Robert would reject him. Damn it. Grace punched the card holder twice as hard. How could he have accidentally kissed him then? Obviously, it should have been a little more steady. At least, make friends with Robert first. Walking out of the cubicle, Robert had the same mixed feelings. He didn't know how else this could be handled other than cold turkey. He finished his check and collected his complicated thoughts before reappearing in the cubicle. Just as he was about to pick up his shirt, he saw Grace stagger to her feet and almost fall again. All right, drunk. Robert's body caught Grace a step ahead of thought, leaning the man against his own shoulder. There was a faint woody fragrance on his body. Grace had smelled it if there was any when she was filming the movie, but now that she was leaning on Robert, she had actually sniffed it thoroughly. Obviously cold and ascetic style, but provoked his little heart flutter, 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 flutter. Robert, thank you. With this reaction from Robert, he didn't feel the need to ask anything more. At least, Robert still cared about him. Grace laughed lowly, causing Robert to just feel confused. Never mind, no bullshit with drunk people. Robert gathered his thoughts and felt the heat of where Grace was leaning on self again. He used to ask the waiter to help him. Why did he do it himself today? Robert wanted to throw Grace down, but was a little reluctant to do so. Are you going back to the company quarters? Robert pressed the man next to a streetlight and took out his cell phone to call a cab, but halfway through typing it in, Grace snapped out. Wait, Robert. I remember you live in the Longseong neighborhood, right? Uh-huh. Robert stopped his fingers and raised his eyes to Grace, only to get an unexpected answer. My family has a suite there. Let's go there together to avoid the trouble of detouring. What? Your family has a suite of what? Robert looked squarely at Grace, not seeing the lie in his frown, and suddenly got a little indignant. Good, it'll save us some trouble tomorrow. His face was unassuming, but the sound of finger tapping on the screen to change the address became noticeably louder. Struggling hard for several years is not as good as someone else's casting. Do you think it's infuriating? The car was parked downstairs. Robert was still wondering if Grace could go back on her own, and was about to speak when Grace stepped into the hallway behind him first. Hey, don't you think it's coincidental that fate comes at such an opportune time? Your house is also in this building? Hearing Robert's question, Grace also took a special look at the building number to make sure it was correct, nodded, walked into the elevator, and then pressed the floor. Your house is on this floor too? Uh-huh. Robert didn't know what to say until he saw Grace walk up to the door across the hall from his house. Your house is this one. Grace blinked, glanced at Robert, then at the door to her own house, and hemmed and hawed. It is indeed my house. I didn't expect that either. Watching Grace enter the code to open the door, Robert nearly broke his defenses. So many buildings. So many floors. So many rooms. You're telling me you live across the street from my house. You think you are writing a delayed novel. Who are you bluffing? Trying not to get too worked up, he nodded and turned to open the door to his room. Ah, quite a coincidence. It's not. Grace looked seriously back at Robert. It is a good coincidence, haha. He didn't know if this was an assist from the gods. After all, he only heard Robert say that he asked Assistant Wong to bring him back to this neighborhood 2 days ago, and at that time he didn't think much about it. He originally either lived in the old mansion, or at school, or at the company dormitory, and basically didn't come to stay here, and this suite was usually cleaned by a cleaner who was hired to clean the suite once a month. Therefore, he really did not know that the original male god's house across the door was his own room. If he had known that, he would still be living in the company's dormitory. Grace greedily watched Robert enter the house, and hurriedly added, Robert, well, good night, see you tomorrow. You also have an early rest, see you tomorrow. As the door was closed, Robert's figure completely disappeared. Grace still laughed uncontrollably. He only felt that everything that happened today was like a full-blown movie, and now that the movie had finally ended, a hint of silence after the passion rose in his heart. He leaned his back against the door, going over everything in his mind before slowly spitting out 2 words, Robert. He was starting to relive that kiss again, worrying that his lips might have been a little dry today, and scratched Robert. Leaning halfway against the door, he lifted his hand and tapped it on his lips, took off his shoes, and went inside. Then took a picture of self's red lips in the mirror. On September 23rd, these are the lips that were kissed with Robert. Phew. The profile was uploaded to his private folder. Then he began to undress, then picked up one of the dog pillows on the bed, recreating the way he had just hugged Robert, and stood in front of the mirror again. Click. On September 23rd, this was the body that had hugged Robert. He was afraid that self would forget, and even more afraid that this was one of the only times he would ever touch Robert in his life. Without worry, he could no longer restrain the desire that grew wildly in his heart. On the other hand, on Robert's side, he was not as crazy as Grace. He just covered his face and laughed bitterly. He could sense that he was getting a little too close to Grace. Originally, he thought it was just some good feelings, but just now Grace mentioned that kiss again. He could no longer trick himself to forget it. How could he be a little touched? Obviously, there was so much separation between them. Hey, he turned and walked into the bathroom. Ever since crossing the pit of having a crush on a straight guy, Robert had locked self away. Technically, only the guy he met back then was considered the closest thing to a romantic relationship. almost prying his heart open. However, that person crushed Robert's emotions for the sake of his career and stepped on Robert's broken heart to successfully gain traffic. After that incident, there was the incident of Robert's angry dislike of the fired CP back then, and it also made Robert's tentacles of longing for love that had been stretched out once again shrunk back to the inside of a snail's shell. Over time, he was too lazy to get up his mind to find someone. Thinking about Grace, when he first met her, he only thought that Grace was another young master who aspired to the glamour of the camera, but with the contact afterward, he realized that Grace was serious about her status as an artiste and was not just playing around. After filming together, Grace was like a small stove, radiating warmth towards him all the time, roasting his long-cooled heart and slowly revitalizing it. Today's kiss had instantly ignited him, and he hadn't thought that he would be so unable to resist the temptation. But that person couldn't be Grace. Robert thought rationally. Not only is there an age difference between himself and Grace, even his family is one in the sky and one on the ground. Acting was his way of life. He had no other choice but to act. But Grace is different. He is a young master. Even if he is serious about acting, there are still many countless choices. Thinking so, Robert counted himself shamefully and smiled helplessly. That's it. Let's wait until we finish this movie and then distance ourselves from Grace. Shoo shoo shoo. Grace, who didn't know Robert's change of heart, happily took a shower and lay on the bed, then sent 3 messages to his brother in a row. Brother, I walloped Robert. I kissed Robert. I hugged Robert. It's really bad luck to be Grace's own brother and to be fed dog food at night. This was Darren's first reaction. Looking at Grace's message, he really wanted to reply. Did I ask you? He rubbed the corners of his sore eyes, put down the financial report, and returned a single word. Read. This was the greatest tenderness he gave for the sake of years of brotherhood. Grace, brother, you're so cold. I'm so sad. Why don't you even congratulate me? Darren, what time is it, and you're still up? If you make any more noise, I'll send all your black materials to Robert. Grace, huh? It's not. Brother, are you so cruel? Where's the brotherhood? Where's brotherhood? Where's the love? Darren, the moment you fed me dog food, it all went up in smoke. Darren exited the program and glanced at the time. 12:12, and then looked at the information in his hand. He was so upset that he didn't bother to look at it. He didn't want to talk about love affairs with his own stupid brother. Is the company things are not enough? Workaholics don't need love. Some people have a good night's sleep, some toss and turn all night. Yes, the one who sleeps well is Robert. He's got a fire going, so he takes the fire out of himself, and then he has a dreamless night. The one who tossed and turned was naturally Darren, who spent the whole night dreaming about the sauce. It was hard to get through the night, and Grace was mortified when he opened his eyes again. But the sudden ringing of the bell brought his sanity back. TCH, you can't blame anyone for setting your own alarm clock. Grace honestly rolled out of bed, then tossed the sheets balled up into the washing machine and started churning, then sent a message to the maid at home for someone to come change the sheets. As for what the alarm clock was for, to remind him that he hadn't had a morning walk in days, of course. Robert was just about washed and dressed when he came back upstairs with his breakfast in a slight sweat. Knock knock. There was a knock at the door and Robert's first thought was Stephen, but a quick glance at the clock showed that he hadn't gotten up late today, so it shouldn't be. He put down the bean grinder he was holding and walked over to open the door, and to his eyes was a big, still hot doggy Grace, fresh from exercising. Grace. Robert looked up and down in confusion, and saw the faint greenish color under his eyes that revealed the fact that he didn't sleep well last night. You didn't sleep well last night, and still got up this early? Robert just assumed that Grace hadn't slept well because she was drunk and didn't think anything of it. But Grace was so shocked that she almost fell to her knees. You can tell that? Can't even know about me washing the sheets? Robert, of course, would not know that Grace had dreamed all night, in which the character was still his own. He just smiled gently. Don't drink in the future, just don't drink. You are so weak. Be careful to get drunk and be sold. Oh, so he didn't see it. Grace breathed a sigh of relief and smiled with a red face. Thank you, Robert, for your concern. Then he lifted up the things in his hand, gave Robert a glance, then said, Robert, is it too early? I just bought hot dry noodles downstairs. The flavor is very authentic. You try it. Ghostly, Robert took it. Thanks. Do you want to come in and sit for a while? Junko should be here soon. God knew he actually ate very little in the morning, usually just a bowl of cereal. Realizing that his body was reacting one step ahead of his conscious mind, Robert let out a quiet tisk. But having said that, he couldn't shut Grace out again. Instead, Grace's eyes lit up when she heard she could come inside. May I? Uh-huh. Robert took out a pair of clean slippers and put them on the floor. Change into these, clean ones. He felt like Grace had a kind of magic power that made it impossible to refuse. Even Stephen, his assistant who had been with him for several years, was rarely invited into the house by him. Grace was just completely oblivious to Robert's kinks, or too excited to notice. Good. Thanks, Robert. I'll come in then. He took off his shoes and flashed the fan five-fingered socks he was wearing. So weird. Afterglow swept over the pale pink color. Robert couldn't help but look twice more. Grace's feet were slender, the five-finger socks wrapped tightly around her toes. And with this slamming pink, well, it was inexplicably delightful. Robert couldn't help but wonder a little if Grace's insides would be pink as well. He shook his head hurriedly to dismiss the unseemly thought and turned back to the kitchen to continue the coffee business he'd just missed, leaving only one thing to say. Make yourself comfortable. Grace didn't find a stool to sit on. He was so intent on seeing what the boy god's place looked like that his eyes naturally couldn't stop looking around. The main color of black and white, paired with light-colored wooden floors and furniture, the atmosphere of the whole house was just like Robert's people, cold and minimalist. There were no excessive accessories in the room. A large bookshelf stood by the wall, filled with all kinds of books, a large portion of which were performance-related, while the rest were all kinds of miscellaneous books. Grace even had a sharp eye to see a copy of The Bossy President Loves Me, BL, in the corner, and in the same compartment were all kinds of BLS. On this, Grace glanced at Robert, who was busy in the kitchen, with a slightly probing look, and was in a slightly excited mood. Straight men, supposedly, don't read BL, do they? He licked his lips, thinking that if Robert was really the same, then the probability of his success would be quite a bit higher again. Suppressing the thought in his mind, Grace continued to survey Robert's house. Next to the bookshelf is a display shelf, on which are filled with large and small trophies that Robert has won over the years, all of which are highlighting the master's excellence. Grace was a little envious and felt that Robert deserved all these awards. He, Robert, was the best. Then go to take a closer look at the living room. Inside the small sofa or lazy chair are all single models, surrounded by a lonely small round table, all for the expensive home theater service. But Grace thought wrongly. With this kind of arrangement, it was obvious at a glance that the owner of the house was still single. And as he looked down, a ball in the paper basket suddenly fell into his eyes. The white ball contrasted sharply with the black plastic bag, and it was impossible not to pay attention to it. Grace realized that the yellow river was coming again, and gave a cry of misfortune. Embarrassed, she glanced back at Robert and found that his back was still turned to her, so she hurriedly walked to the bar and sat down as a cover. But in fact, Robert had already noticed it as early as when Grace was staring blankly at her own trash can. He was too embarrassed to warn her, so he turned around and continued to spin the empty bean grinder, waiting for Grace to walk away. It wasn't until he heard Grace's footsteps approaching that he turned restrainedly and calmly, holding up the coffee pot in his hand and gesture. Coffee either? Huh. Grace breathed a sigh of relief as well, then nodded hurriedly. I want it. There was a funnel full of ground coffee on top of the sharing pot, and it was full of ground coffee, a portion for two at a glance, which Robert had just refilled. He poured hot water into the long-spouted jug and poured slowly, the mist of water bringing up a burst of aroma. Robert's hands were steady, circling around to control the slow flow of water, gracefully completing the stream of one cut. Perfection. He leapt in his mind, while the corners of his lips curled slightly. The feeling that everything was under his control was his daily little treat. The floral aroma that flooded the water vapor was a far cry from the bitterness that the coffee sold outside carried. Robert poured out a cup and handed it to Grace, then pushed the small saucer with the coffee made over. Add your own. He picked up the brewed coffee, put it under his nose, closed his eyes to carefully distinguish the flavor, and then took a sip, letting the flavor of the coffee fully cover his mouth. He has always been fascinated by the unique fruity acidic flavor of light roasted coffee. Moreover, after buying various flavors of beans, Robert also used to blindly choose one every day, or a combination of several, so that he could experience a different taste. Grace was afraid of bitterness. He picked up 3 packets of Coffee Mate, but looking at Robert's expression of enjoyment, he stopped trying to tear open the package. Is it really that good? He half-heartedly followed Robert's movements and savored a sip, smacking his lips. It was still bitter, but it seemed acceptable. Robert, why does this coffee taste different from what I used to drink? Robert was amused by his action of feeling bitter again and wanting to taste it again. He let out a light laugh and explained, the ones you used to drink should be dark roasted. Following that, he took out the bag of coffee. I bought light roasted beans. This kind of roasting retains more of the original flavor of the coffee beans with more fruit acids, so there are more layers. If you like it, you can take this bag back and brew it for yourself. The coffee beans he hoarded, those were all fine products. But Grace didn't take it, just tried another sip, carefully distinguishing the flavors, then nodded in understanding. So it is. Thank you, Robert, for your kind words, but I don't have any of these at home, and I can't get any of these, so I won't spoil Robert's coffee beans. Robert didn't force himself, and hummed softly, before remembering that there was a bowl of hot dry noodles on hand waiting to fix itself. Well, at least it was a peace of mind. Grace stared at Robert eating noodles on the surface, but in fact, she was already thinking about it. He gave Robert breakfast. Robert returned his coffee. Rounding up, they have exchanged love tokens. Hey, 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 hey. Darren's happiness is so simple. He has even started to arrange the wedding scene for the two of them. Although Robert, who was eating noodles with his head down, didn't know what was going on in Grace's head, those two burning gazes were really hard to ignore. He put down his chopsticks and looked at Grace suspiciously. Is there something on my face? No, no. Grace denied immediately back, then reddened the tips of her ears in embarrassment. Robert withdrew his eyes, but inexplicably added, if you still want coffee, you can come over and see me in the morning. The words left his mouth, and he barely restrained himself from dropping the bowl immediately. It really felt like it had been subdued. Obviously, he had already thought of keeping his distance yesterday. Grace didn't care at all about Robert's tangled feelings. He was already enjoying himself. Good. Thanks, Robert. He was so excited that he was close to wagging the imaginary tail behind him to the sky. And if it wasn't for the doorbell ringing to bring back some sanity, he would have wanted to hug Robert and kiss him hard. Robert, I'll get the door. Without waiting for Robert to say anything, Grace rushed to the door like the wind, as if she was greeting the Moon King. Robert, who stayed in the same place, rubbed his fingers helplessly, and then cleaned up the cluttered bar, while cleaning up his complicated mind. Forget it, just think of it purely as having a younger brother. Grace had just opened the door when she heard Stephen's words, but not all of them. Morning, Robert, on good. Stephen froze in place, looking up wide-eyed to confirm the door number and then at Grace, unable to comprehend why this person was in Robert's house. He didn't have the wrong door. Darren, Grace? What are you doing in Robert's place? Stephen's small eyes were big with confusion. But Grace, who was immersed in joy, didn't even hear Stephen's question and quickly returned, Good morning, Wong, and then answered him with her actions. Just saw Grace walked out of Robert's house, pushed open the door of her own room, and walked in as a matter of course. Robert, I'm going to change my clothes. I'll be right there. Leaving Stephen to explode in place. This. Stephen froze for half a day without slowing down, but he heard Robert's voice. Shunzi. Good morning. I'll bring something down right away. You go back to the car and wait first. Oh, okay. Robert, I'll go down first then. It was over. The CPU was going to burn. Stephen got into the elevator before summarizing what had just happened into 2 sentences. Grace was in Robert's house. Grace pushed open the door to Robert's room across the hall. So the young master mentioned earlier is such a rich man. Stephen suddenly had a deep impression of the word rich. It turns out that rich people can live wherever they want. Haha, it's a good thing we're not living together. I almost thought too much about it. Phew, you're scaring yourself. But just to be on the safe side, Stephen still found a time to confirm with Robert alone after arriving at the set. So, Robert, did you dive Grace? He said this without thinking, and Robert was shocked for a while before he responded. Dive? What the hell kind of shit are you talking about? How did I dive him? Stephen laughed awkwardly, making sure that Robert's look didn't seem fake, and hastily dropped it. No, it's not like I saw you two on a date. No, a dinner date together last night, and then again, showing up at your house this morning. He gave Robert a you-know-what look. Isn't that the plot of those playing 419? Face off, and then take it home. Play nice and move on. Play bad, and the next one is better behaved. Although he knew Robert had always been an ascetic mannequin, but Grace wasn't just rushing up to him. What are you thinking? Robert gave Stephen a popping chestnut and shook his head helplessly. Grace lives right across the street from me. I think he finished his morning walk this morning and stopped by to bring me breakfast, so I invited him in for a coffee. So. Stephen covered his head, indicating that he understood, but then subconsciously remembered. He hadn't even had coffee made by Robert. That's really his house? I thought no one lived in that one. It's not like Grace bought it on purpose to get close to you, is it? Get your head out of your ass. We're just regular friends, and he only just realized that the suite is right across the street from my house. Robert emphasized the word ordinary, as if he was not only talking to Stephen, but also to himself. He was really afraid of Self's physical reaction to wanting to get close to Grace. Wasn't it just a bit of a heart attack? Was it necessary to bypass the layer of reason? Physical, it's necessary, or you'll have to be single for the rest of your life. I don't want to be a vegetarian for the rest of my life. Stephen nodded exaggeratedly, and then exaggeratedly came up to Robert's ear. Really, just friends? Ordinary friends you can invite into the house? I don't even get that. Robert almost didn't slap him in the face as he pushed Stephen away, not saying a word. At least it's the assistant who has been with me for 3 years. Forget it. Not angry. Today's scene is about the second male, Charles, played by Grace, who comes home from summer vacation to find out that his alcoholic father knows about Self and Natasha, and therefore has an emotional outburst and a big fight. Just Grace's first time acting this kind of emotional outburst drama. Inevitably some grasp, either did not burst out, or too much to look very fake, getting a number of bars. All told you. Here to burst out. How come you can't explode it? Wan Liang said so much that he was about to explode. His words reached Robert's ears, causing him to unconsciously frown while his fingers holding the script began to subconsciously twist and rub. He was trying to make Director One calm down, not for anything else. Having thus convinced himself, Robert looked to Stephen. Shunzi, is there any more sour plum soup? Bring me 2 cups over. There's more. There's more. Robert, here. Stephen immediately put down his cell phone and took out 2 cups of sour plum soup from the insulated box behind him and handed it over. Robert didn't notice the puzzled expression on his face and took it and headed to the center of the field. Director One, the weather is too dry. Drink some sour plum soup to quench your thirst. Robert's voice interjected abruptly, interrupting Wen Liang's mind that wanted to continue exploding. He turned back to his senses, looked at the sour plum soup Robert handed over, and tried to put on a smile. Thanks a lot. Well, small thing. Robert waved his hand, not taking his anger seriously. Following that, he shifted his eyes to another person who was covered in low pressure and rushed at Wen Liang again. Director One, you take a break first. I'll instruct him for a couple of sentences. It'll be quick. Wen Liang didn't even expect Robert to take the initiative to help him teach someone, but Robert had said so. He naturally gave face. Good. Then I'll leave him to you. After saying that, he turned back and picked up a loudspeaker and shouted, the whole field rests for 10 minutes. Having gotten the order, Robert left a sentence and turned around. Follow me. Grace did as she was told. Anyone else would have rolled their eyes and said, who the hell are you? Robert shooed Stephen out and closed the door. Seeing that Grace was still not too happy, he directly reached out and pressed the cold sour plum soup onto Grace's face, and his eyes revealed interest. Not happy. Grace was jolted by the coolness, which caused her to look up accusingly and shift her eyes from her toes to Robert's face, meeting Robert's calm eyes. Robert, am I, kinda untalented? Of course not. Robert pressed Grace into a chair and poked the sealing film of the sour plum soup with a straw and handed it to Grace. It's just that you can't find the feeling. Just calm down and think about it. Drink some, your lips are dry. I'll help you feel better later. Oh, Grace blinked, and before she could react, she directly lowered her head and took in the straw. Sucking. A blast of cold went down his esophagus, giving his whole body a big cool down. That's when he woke up. I don't think he picked it up. So now Robert was feeding him. Realizing this, all the low pressure and lack of talent vanished. Robert hand feeds him sour plum soup. Hey. He was so proud of himself again. But not for long. Robert's voice reached Grace's ears. Help yourself. Okay. Thank you, Robert. Robert, you are so nice. Grace raised her hands in obedience to Robert's words, and even brought Robert's hands together in her palms. The slightly sweaty palm was like a steamer, provoking Robert to immediately draw back his hand, put it into his pocket, and took half a step back. Is this person a dog? How come the palm of his hand is so hot? Chapter 8. After calming down his inner panic, Robert finally remembered the main thing and picked up Grace's script. Haven't you ever quarreled with your father before? This part of the scene was still quite simple in his opinion. It was just a matter of enduring to the extreme and then raging in a fit of anger. That's all there was to it, just one emotion. But Grace, as a young lord who had been spoiled from childhood, simply didn't understand what it meant to disobey his father's orders. Although his father is strict, but as long as it is what he wants to do, will be supported, and even after doing wrong, will be given the opportunity to continue to correct or give up the choice. Therefore, from the beginning of his contact with acting, the young master who had never known how to explode was now in trouble. No, hey, everyone in my family kinda spoils me. My dad is strict, but he talks quite a bit of sense, and I don't even get a chance to argue with him. Gotta. Robert rolled his eyes in his mind, and then when he thought of his own family's pre-divorce bickering parents, he threw Grace an odd look. I don't know if it was envy or jealousy. Sure enough, the youngest son of a rich family of all evils. But after spitting, and then meeting Grace's clear eyes like a white rabbit, and the self reflected in her pupils, Robert suddenly felt that this was also quite good. What does a young master have to go through so many bad things for? Robert sighed. So think about it. What would happen if you had to fight with your father? Or a fight with one of the elders? The first thought that went through Grace's head was when his brother had argued with his dad earlier. At that time, his brother wanted to read a book, but his father wouldn't let him, strongly requesting his brother to go out and exercise. And then before there was much of a fight, his mother and father suddenly came with a sentence that instantly calmed the storm. How do you say? If you're overweight, you'll be eating chicken breasts and broccoli for every meal? No. Grace shook his head and gave up on that example. Then his eyes fell on Robert, and his eyes grew strange. Right. There was once a young master in their circle that they played together, who also had a crush on a popular star, and then brought it back home while the family feast was going on. When she thought of that scene, even if the anger wasn't directed at him, Grace still shivered. That banquet could simply be described as a cocktail party. One wanted to arrange a marriage, the other wanted to fall in love freely, and the noise lifted all the tables, chairs and benches in the banquet hall. Only he was brought home by his brother halfway through the banquet. and didn't even see the end of it. The result is still his brother told him. The old man directly stopped the bank card. Not 2 days that young master went back to obediently engaged. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do that. Thinking about it, Grace substituted herself. If he could be with Robert. Grace glanced at Robert and gulped. Said nothing could separate them. Then substituting into the picture of that old man. It's just a fight. Who wouldn't? Robert was following Grace and was all too familiar with the change in him, and immediately his eyes lit up. Feeling it? Go and try. He also thought that if Grace couldn't find the feeling, he would have a fight with Grace. It seems that it is not necessary. And for some reason, Robert breathed a sigh of relief. Grace couldn't say anything more in time, trying to remember that scene before nodding vigorously at Robert and snatching the door open. Rule number 7, action. Charles pushed the door open and stepped inside, while the drunken man sitting in the living room staggered to his feet with him. The fact that his son was screwing another man, and the person who told him about it was the same girl he was engaged to, was something that Charles's father couldn't understand no matter how he thought about it. So he numbed himself with alcohol. You still have the face to come back? Come over here for me. On your knees. Dragging his suitcase, Charles didn't even know what he had done to piss this man off, and froze in place for a second before impatiently skimming his lips and trying to ignore Charles's father. Charles's father didn't let him. With the stimulation of alcohol, he picked up the bottle in his hand and smashed it over. Who taught you to pull and tug with a man? Who taught you to pull and tug with a man? I've lost all my face to you. I'm telling you, break it off before it's too late. First dodging the bottle and then hearing this from Charles's father, Charles understood. He didn't even expect Olivia to move so fast, taking advantage of the first day of college vacation to talk to his dad about this. Olivia told you that? She's quite the long-winded talker. What do you mean? She's the one I betrothed you to. Charles's father, irritated even more by his words, reached out to slap him, and if Charles hadn't dodged quickly, another 5 fingerprints would have appeared on his face. Looking at the man in front of him, Charles laughed out softly. He couldn't hide before, but now, he wouldn't fight back. He just stepped back and sneered at Charles's father. What era is this? Still dull marriage? Aren't you just looking at the little bit of money in the person's family? I'm telling you, Olivia and I, it's never going to happen. He hit the nail on the head and tore down the cloth of shame in Charles's father's heart. Over the years, Charles's father had borrowed Charles's name to ask Olivia for money countless times, but he hadn't been able to pay it back once. He thought Charles didn't know. Annoyed and controlled by alcohol, Charles's father angrily copied an empty wine bottle again and pointed at Charles. What the fuck did you say? If I don't beat you to death today, I'll take your name. Ha! As if he had heard the funniest joke ever, Charles was bursting into tears of laughter. He lowered his head and passed his brain under the bottle, but his eyes stared straight at Charles's father. Come on, hit here. I don't want to live anymore. There was a long silence. The bottle didn't go up after all. A rare moment of clarity flashed in Charles's father's eyes. He was scared. He couldn't control Charles anymore. Charles, on the other hand, took in the frustration on his face and snorted, coward. He peeled away the bottle that was held aloft and about to fall on his head, and turned around with the case and headed out the door again. You go over there with your booze. With that said, he threw the door shut hard. Bang! The windows all shook with it. Don't come back if you've got the fucking balls. Charles's father snarled through clenched teeth at the door, and the camera panned to show Charles on the other side, leaning against the door without answering, gritting his teeth and trying hard to restrain his own tear ducts from that so-called cowardice present. Finally, with determined eyes, he left the building with his suitcase. Card. This one over. Obviously, Director Wynn's trumpet voice resounded throughout the room, but Grace acted as if he hadn't heard it, and the tears instantly flowed out, like a dam with an open valve, out of control. He had just acted out the imagery of Self breaking up with his father. He was suddenly afraid that Self's years of fondness were worthless in his father's eyes. Grace, come back to your senses. Take a moment to rest on the side. The crew on the set moved and started to set up the next scene. One of the cameramen was still a bit tired of Grace being in the way and pulled him to the outside of the set. But Grace wasn't a movie star, and the tears were able to stop at the drop of a hat. It was a moment he had never experienced before. Everyone was busy with their own business, and he was like a world apart, crying on his own, and had to avoid getting in the way of others. At once, he felt even more aggrieved, and the teardrops directly turned into a pouring rain poured on the ground until he heard Robert's cold and clear voice. Come with me to the restroom first. Grace raised her head to see Robert's expression, but because her vision was blurred by tears, she had to follow quite nicely, her hand subconsciously tugging at the hem of Robert's coat. When he noticed Grace's hand grabbing the hem of his shirt, Robert just stiffened for a moment, but didn't take Grace's hand away. He took Grace back to the lounge before he turned back and held her down on the sofa, while he went to get a tissue to hand over. Wipe. A clean hand held a wad of paper out in front of Self's eyes, but Grace was a little afraid of dirtying that hand, and just carefully pinched the corner of the wad. Robert withdrew his hand, took a deep breath, and turned to go out. More crying? Why don't I go out first? You be alone. But Grace suddenly wasn't afraid of dirtying Robert, and immediately reached out to pull Robert's hand. Don't. With a thick nasal voice, he lowered his head and pleaded. Robert, hiccup, stay with me. Hiccup, for a while, hiccup, okay? In Robert's eyes, it was the feeling of a 1-meter 8 little puppy squatting on the sofa and crying, very good to ravage. He couldn't hold it at all. Okay, I'll keep you company. Then his fingers moved slightly, and his empty hand still couldn't hold back and landed on Grace's head, and began smoothing her hair one after another. Grace's hair was on the hard side and felt exactly as expected. A little tangled, but lovingly so. Robert was surprised to find it a bit addictive for a moment, and didn't even notice in time when Grace stopped crying. It wasn't until the sobbing was much quieter, and just wooing started to tickle his fancy, that Robert realized the perversity of Self's behavior. He jerked his hand back to prevent Self's dowsing from being affected by Grace. I'll get you some water. The gentle touch on the top of his head suddenly disappeared, and Grace still felt a little unfulfilled. He subconsciously thought if Robert would touch his head when he cried, he wouldn't mind crying 2 more times. Immediately afterward, he spurned the thought. Meh, pervert. The two of them had similar mugs. After all, Grace had bought the same model accordingly, and when they were put together it was easy to pick them up and mix them up if you didn't look closely, while Robert absent-mindedly picked up his own thermos in passing. Have some water. Robert didn't notice, but Grace actually did. But he didn't pick it out, and pretending to be stupid, he took Robert's glass of water and brought it straight to his lips. Until he saw the bottom of the glass, Robert didn't realize that the bottom color was only from his own glass, and suddenly panicked. Hey, Grace, this glass. But it was a little too late for him to stop, as Grace had already drank every drop of water from the glass. It's mine. Hearing Robert's words, Grace then pretended to be flustered and picked up the cup to scrutinize herself. In fact, he was practically bubbling over in his heart. Okay? Robert had drunk his sweet hay. Sorry, Robert. I'll just go and fill it up for you. As a matter of fact, Robert had added salt to the glass to prevent electrolyte imbalance caused by heavy sweating. It was sweet or salty but a thought. Chapter 9. We're just friends. We are ordinary friends. We are ordinary friends. Watching Grace's figure walk out of the lounge, Robert closed his eyes and brainwashed himself over and over again. He had subconsciously distanced himself from his male friends after he had completed his self-identification, and now he had forgotten how he used to play around with the straight men. In those days, sharing a bottle of water wasn't an affliction. But this was not the same time. Even if he hypnotized himself, he still couldn't restrain the idea of indirect kissing. Cam, how can you be so flirty? Robert, have some face. Grace is 8 years younger than you. There's no way she'll look at you. The little man in his heart cursed himself. But before he finished cursing, Grace had already come back with the cups. Robert, let me put your cup on the table for you. Robert used the surface of the ancient well to cover up the shocking waves in his heart, calmly stretched out his hand. No, give it to me. It just so happens that I am also thirsty. Cough, cough, cough. Finished. The words indirect kissing took up residence in his mind. Robert, is everything okay? Grace rushed up to the cup on the floor and thoughtfully patted Robert on the back. God, choke me to death, Robert thought to himself. But his prayers were unsuccessful. Robert had to unscrew the lid and take a sip of water to calm his breath. Hey, it's still warm. The kid is a bit plastered on the body. He was bittersweet. Grace sat down in front of the mirror while Robert drank his water, only to notice that Self had just turned around outside with a big splotchy face. Robert, didn't I just, well, kind of look funny? And didn't wait for Robert to answer. He laughed to himself. It's still pretty funny when your face is all splattered, isn't it? As long as I'm not embarrassed, it's others who are embarrassed. Looking at Grace's back, Robert thought. It's actually not funny. It's cute and makes people want to keep bullying and crying. He was all shocked by his own thoughts and hurriedly withdrew the eyes that fell on Grace, feeling like a pervert. It's nothing. Anyone goes through this, and sometimes I have a hard time getting out of the movie. Grace removed her makeup once and asked, really? Robert, however, didn't answer Grace's question, but instead picked up the script with his mind on it and started pretending to memorize his lines. Not getting a response from Robert, Grace wasn't annoyed as he wiped his face twice and spoke up again. Robert, actually. Looking through the mirror and noticing Robert's slight sideways glance, Grace continued, I just brought in a scene while acting. It was about going home and telling my dad that I was going to be with someone I really, really liked, and then having a huge fight with him. I had to get him to agree. If he doesn't agree, I'll run away from home. Watching Grace's indignant movements, Robert only felt amused. Suddenly, he had a feeling that Grace's father wouldn't object if Grace was really, really into it. But as his thoughts turned, Robert couldn't help but ask, you have a favorite? Grace hurriedly turned back around, but then peeked through the mirror to see Robert's reaction. His heart beating extremely fast, he nodded honestly. Yes, There is someone I like very much. Through the mirror, he looked at Robert with anticipation, just waiting for Robert to continue with his question. However, Robert didn't play by the rules. Oh, you're just getting your career off the ground. It's best not to expose it. After Robert finished speaking, he lowered his eyes and squeezed the script in his hand hard. So it's one with an owner. So what's the point of having his heart set on it? What happened to saying that all humans are gossipy? Grace hastily turned her head to look at Robert and opened her mouth to make a bold statement, but was interrupted from what she wanted to say by a sudden knock on the door. Poking his head in was Stephen. How Grace had looked at him happily in the morning and how icy it was now. At that moment, it was as if he had fallen into an ice cellar and shivered in the cold. What was going on here? But he didn't think much about it. Grace, how are you doing? Director Wynn said to start shooting. Then he turned his head to call Robert. Robert, you need to get ready too. Robert seemed as if he couldn't wait any longer. Hearing his words, he hurriedly put down the script and stood up, directly heading towards the door, and stopped when he passed Stephen. By the way, call the makeup artist to come and touch up Grace's makeup. But didn't even look at Grace.